Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church in Santa Monica, California.
We meet in person and online on Sundays at 10 a.m. Pacific Time. Our in-person service is held indoors at Joslyn Park Auditorium, which is at 633 Kensington Road.
And our pre-recorded online service can be found on our website, solachurch.life, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. That's at Sola Church LA.
And we have a great service for you today. Let's worship.
This His mercy seat. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. I will adore you. Clothed in rainbows of living color, flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder. Blessing and power, strength and glory and power be to you, the only wise King. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Filled with wonder, awestruck wonder, at the mention of your name. Jesus, your name is power, breath and living water, such a marvelous mystery. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. I will With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out today, please don't feel obligated to participate. But if Sola Church is your church home, or these online services have been a blessing to you, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to schedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to scan the QR code on your screen, but you can always go to solachurch.life and click the tab at the top that says Give.
By God's grace and your generosity, we've been able to launch this church plant here in Santa Monica. We're slowly growing it into something impactful, and so that's just due again to God's goodness, but also to yours. Thank you for being a partner in all of this.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
So I used AI to come up with some examples of things that we regret. And the list is just so relatable, like I'm eating too much or the late night snacking, you thought you could get away with eating that much, that late. And then about halfway through the night, you're like filled with regret. Or what about the impulsive online shopping? It's a lot of fun while you're clicking, and then the next time you open your door, you can't even leave the house because there's just a pile of Amazon boxes. Or what about those times that you decided to try a new hair color or a new haircut, and afterwards you're just like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? So much regret. Those times that we ignored instructions, you got home with that piece of IKEA furniture and you were just sure that you could figure out how to put it together by yourself. You get about halfway through and you're like, oh man, that was a huge mistake. Can we just start over? And along those lines, you think about one of these DIY home projects that seemed like such a good idea on the front end, but boy, the further into it you get, you realize I'm making a much bigger mess, a much bigger problem than I started with. Oh goodness. I mean, like I have regrets for real, and so do you. And we could speak about like a spectrum of regret, everything from minor regret to moderate regret to major regrets. Major, well, yeah, I'm talking about those deep life-altering regrets, like the broken relationships, the moral and ethical failures. The question is, will we learn from our mistakes? What will we learn from our mistakes? Let's turn in the Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 13. We have called this series in 1 and 2 Samuel Outliers. What is an outlier? Well, if everything in the group is like this, the outlier is like that. If everything in the group is like that, the outlier is like this. And so for our purposes, by outliers, we mean imperfect people who have found another way of being in this broken world, a way made possible by this loving, giving, forgiving God that we meet in the pages of the Bible. We're going to call this one Learning from Our Mistakes. And I want to talk first about cascading regret. So look with me at chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. It says, after this, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Remember, David had many wives, and so he had children with different mothers. Amnon was so distressed over his sister Tamar that he became sick, for she was a virgin, meaning that she was unmarried. She was young. And it was improper for Amnon to do anything to her, obviously physically, sexually. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother. Now, Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to Amnon, why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner day after day? Will you not tell me? Amnon said to him, I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister. So Jonadab said to him, lie down in your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, please let my sister Tamar come and give me food and prepare the food in my sight that I may see it and eat it from her hand. Then Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, please let Tamar, my sister, come and make me a couple of cakes for me in my sight that I may eat from her hand. Now, remember, David is living with the consequences of forgiven sin. In chapter 11, we saw that David was guilty of, at the very least, sexual misconduct, of conspiracy to commit murder. And the prophet Nathan in chapter 12 told David that the sword would never depart from his house as a result. David had set some things in motion that, couldn't be stopped. He said that adversity would be raised up against David from within his own house. And so we see that coming to fruition here in chapter 13 in a couple of vignettes. In this first one, David's son Amnon is lovesick, verse 2, over his half-sister. And that's the problem, or at least one of the problems, is that she was his half-sister. For him to be with her was strictly forbidden in the Torah. And then you notice this reference to this friend Jonadab, who immediately begins encouraging Amnon to pursue this thing, to make this thing happen. Man, just a word to the guys like, don't be that guy. Don't be a Jonadab. Don't be that guy that enables other people to do things that are going to be destructive. And we need to also not be BFFs with that guy. Every one of us guys has had a guy friend like that. We've all had a Jonadab in our life who, was always going to encourage us and enable us in all the wrong ways. There's this verse in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33 says, "Do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits." Now, pro tip, when you're studying the Bible, anytime you see that phrase, "do not be deceived," highlight it, because that's something that we are very likely to be deceived about. And one of the biggest mistakes that we make is thinking that we can, have among our closest friends people who don't share our values, people who aren't headed in the direction that we're headed, and it not negatively affect us. Now, I have to qualify that quickly. I don't want to linger too long on this point. I don't mean that we shouldn't be friends with people that are different from us. I think we should be. I think we should have lots and lots and lots of friends with people who share our faith and people who don't, people who share our values and people who don't. But those people that are closest to you, the people that you give the most, influence in your life, they do need to be people that are going in the same direction you are, and when possible, who are further along in that direction than you are. Evil company corrupts good habits. Well, long story short, because we're going to jump over some verses. In fact, we're going to jump over lots of verses today. But Amnon raped his sister Tamar. The disturbing account is found in verses 7 through 14. Let's pick the story up in verse 15. This is immediately after the act has been, completed. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Arise, be gone." So she said to him, "No, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. And then he called his servant who attended him and said, "Here, put this woman out away from me and bolt the door behind her." Now she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. And his servant put her out and bolted the door behind her. But we see that his sister was left desolate in verse 20, that dad was angry, verse 21, and that his brother, Absalom, his half-brother Absalom, who was, a full brother to Tamar. Tamar was his full sister. He hated him. He hated Amnon for this. And that brings us to our second vignette. In verse 23, it came to pass after 2 full years, check out that timestamp, 2 years later, that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. And then Absalom came to the king and said, "Kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." But the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, let us not all go now, lest we be a burden to you." Then he urged him, but he would not go, and he blessed him. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." And the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him. So he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. So again, that timestamp, I mean, Absalom and Amnon didn't speak for 2 years. These brothers didn't speak for 2 years. And we're going to learn later in the chapter in verse 32 that for those 2 years, Absalom was planning Amnon's murder. That from the day the rape happened, Absalom was planning Amnon's murder. So you notice how, David said no, but Absalom urged him. And, and then when David questioned why he wanted his brother Amnon to go, Absalom urged him. I just can't help but wondering if Absalom was a whiny kid. He wouldn't take no for an answer as an adult. I wonder if he was one of those kids who wouldn't take no for an answer. Well, in verse 28, it says, now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each one got on his mule and fled. It could be that they didn't know whether Absalom was going to stop with Amnon. They all ran for their lives. So we see in the verses that follow that Amnon was dead, that Absalom fled, he went into exile, and that David in verse 36 wept, and in verse 37 he mourned. And this is where I want to talk for a moment about what they call cascading regret. When Amnon raped his sister, David was angry, but he did nothing. He didn't do anything about it. And even now when he's sad, he does nothing. David doing nothing. Why do you think David did nothing when Amnon raped his sister? Well, think about the Amnon-Absalom story. Think about the narrative arc. We have sex and we have murder. Sound familiar? Yeah, we're not very far removed from chapter 11, are we? Sex, Bathsheba, murder, Uriah. It's kind of like the kids were a chip off the old block. It's kind of like Amnon was following Dad's example in some ways with his sister Tamar. And like Absalom was following David's example in some ways with his brother Amnon. David was learning that our actions don't just impact us, but they also influence other people negatively. David had set a terrible example in both cases with Bathsheba and then in the cover-up with Uriah. And his sons, Amnon and Absalom, followed his example with disastrous results. And this is where we see the cascading effect of a bad example. Something for us to think about before, we make the mistake, rather than only after we've made the mistake. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1, Paul said the most amazing thing. He said, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. Man, I don't know that any of us could say that with a straight face. How closely do you and I imitate Christ? But Paul is showing us the way here. We want to aspire to be women and men who could say, imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. And particularly in this case where it's David's sons that are following in his footsteps, well, it's just a reminder for us to think about this, those of us who are parents and grandparents, and how the example that we set may affect our children and our grandchildren. I mean, maybe we could even stop and ask ourselves, like, am I the kind of person that I want my children to be? Am I the kind of person that I want my grandchildren to be? That would be a good question for us to wrestle with, even as it relates to being a person of faith. Like if your daughter, your son, or your grandkids, if they loved God the way you love God, is that what you aspire for them? When you think about, the way you practice your faith, if they practice their faith that same way, is that what you're shooting for? Is that what you aspire for them? Like if it's not, if you wouldn't be satisfied, if your kids or your grandkids were to be a person like you, if you wouldn't be satisfied, if they were to have the kind of relationship with God that you have, well, then it's time for you and me to step our game up. It's time for us to be the kind of person that we hope and aspire that they will become. So learning from our mistakes, we could talk about, what we can learn from cascading regret, about the importance of setting a good example, the danger of setting a bad example, but the possibilities when we set a good example. Let's talk about avoidance regret. Chapter 14. First, let me just sort of cue it up a little bit. 3 more years pass. I said that Absalom went into exile. So he's gone. He's in exile for 3 years, estranged from David and the rest of his family for 3 years. And after 3 years, Joab, who was David's co-conspirator in the murder of Uriah, he was guilty of conspiracy before the fact. Joab pulls a Nathan. He takes a page from Nathan's playbook. Remember in chapter 12, when Nathan wanted to confront David about what he had done, he told David a story. And David, was able to set his defenses aside and respond to the story in a way that helped him see the truth about himself. So Joab tries something similar. He finds a woman and he puts her up to this. He puts her up to appearing before David and telling him this fiction, this fabricated story about her having 2 sons, one of whom killed the other, and how everyone wants to execute the living son because he was a murderer, wanting to put him to death, but her not wanting them to put him to death. And she's trying to provoke a response from David. She's basically asking David for permission to let her son live, her remaining son live, so that she doesn't lose both sons, and protection from the people that want to kill her son, that are coming after her and her family. And so David agrees. He agrees with her. But first he smells a rat. Like before he agrees, he's like, did Joab put you up to this? He actually asks her whether Joab put her up to this. And she's like, yeah, he did. But she still makes the case. And so he, agrees with her. He agrees to let Absalom return. That was the whole point, was that Absalom should, not be forced to remain in exile, but he should be allowed to return. And I'm sure that, what Joab had in mind was that he would return to his place in the family, which is we're going to see is not exactly what happens. But the interesting thing is when we compare verses 24 and 28, we haven't gotten to verse 28 yet, but when we compare those verses, we see that in verse 24, when David agreed to let Absalom return, he said, but do not let him see my face. And then we're going to find out in verse 28 that lasts for 2 years. So after he murders his brother, he's in exile for 3 years. And even then when he's allowed to come back, he's not allowed to see his father's face, and 2 more years pass, which would take us 5 years out, right, from the murder. So verse 25, now in all Israel, there was no one who was praised as much as Absalom for his good looks. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. Good-looking guy. And when he cut the hair of his head, at the end of every year, he cut it because it was heavy on him. Once a year? He got his hair cut once a year? Wow. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels, according to the king's standard. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. So an annual haircut. That's like every parent's nightmare that their son only wants to cut his hair once a year. And when he would cut it, what they cut would weigh 5 pounds. Unbelievable. He was like the Fabio of the Old Testament. We're going to learn more about his hair in the story, not this time, but in a future Bible study. But notice that he named his daughter Tamar after his sister. It's telling, isn't it? It's telling about how much he loved his sister, how deeply affected he was by the crime, the violent crime that was committed against her. And so he names his daughter after his sister. Well, picking it up in verse 28, Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, but did not see the king's face. Therefore, Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king. but he would not come to him. And when he sent again the second time, he would not come. So he said to his servants, Absalom said to his own servants, see, Joab's field is near mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. That'll get his attention. And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and came to Absalom's house. It worked. And said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? And Absalom answered Joab, look, I sent to you saying, come here, so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur, that is, returned from exile? It would be better for me to be there still. Like, if you're not going to see me, if you're not going to acknowledge me, why did you bring me home? Now, therefore, let me see the king's face, but if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me. So Joab went to the king and told him. And when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself in his face to the ground before the king. And then the king kissed Absalom. So again, 5 years, 3 years in exile, 2 years back, but not allowed to see his face. I mean, I'm not sure how old Absalom was at this point. Some say he was 40. We'll get to that reference in a bit. But he still needed his dad. But instead, he was experiencing rejection by his father. You know, no matter how old we are, we still need our parents. And no matter how old our kids are, they still need us. You know, parenting doesn't stop when our children turn 18, graduate from high school, and you know, maybe at some point, eventually at some point, they may move out on their own. They may even move to another part of the country, or like, who knows where their path is going to take them. But parenting doesn't stop when those transitional times come. You know, it just changes. It's different. Parenting an adult and parenting a child is different, as I know by experience, and so do many of you. But they still need us. And we as adults still need our adult parents. So instead, however, in verse 39, it says, well, let me add this. The interesting thing is that David ignored his son. But in verse 39 of the previous chapter, we learn that after the initial, period of grief, like David, was grieving losing Amnon. But once he got past, as he's working his way through the stages of grief, at a certain point in time, he began to miss Absalom and to long for Absalom. David longed to go to Absalom, quote unquote, but he didn't. He didn't. All these years have passed. And so we could talk about avoidance regret. For David, he basically had his head in the sand. It was like, on his part, it was a conscious choice to ignore the problem. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes we make a conscious choice to ignore a problem. And maybe we're hoping that it's going to just take care of itself, or maybe that it'll just go away, but it doesn't. And all the procrastinating and all the avoidance of difficult conversations or decisions or tasks, all the ignoring of the symptoms, it doesn't help. The problems just pile up, and so do the missed chances. This is true in every part of our life. I mean, have you ever just avoided dealing with a health issue? How did that work out for you? Have you ever just avoided dealing with a financial issue? How did that work out for you? Have you ever, like David, avoided dealing with a family relationship issue? How's that working for you? Every time in our lives when we try avoidance, it ends up the same way. Things just get worse. We have to do something. Part of what we need to learn from our mistakes is that in a situation like this, we have to act. We have to do something. So that's kind of how David was experiencing it. But what about Absalom? What's worse than hatred? This is what they say, right? That the only thing worse than hatred is indifference. And that's what he was getting from his dad. And, he didn't know that there was some part of his dad that missed him and that longed to be reconciled with him. But how could he? How could he when David was completely absent from his life? Imagine how different this could have been. Imagine if David had seen his son before now. Imagine if they'd had some long, deep conversations. Imagine if David had given Absalom the opportunity to talk about his sister. Like, Absalom, tell me about your sister. Tell me about what that was like for you when that happened to her. Tell me about what you think it was like for her. Tell me about how difficult it was for you to go forward knowing that Amnon was getting away with this. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about your half-brother. Let's talk about your feelings about Amnon. How did you feel about him before it happened and after it happened? And what was it like for you those 2 years between the rape and the murder? And how do you feel now? Like, do you have regrets? Like, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings about all of that? And maybe you could have even talked about their relationship. Like, you know I wasn't there for you when you needed me to be. I didn't deal with Amnon, and then I just basically, ignored you completely, and while you were in exile, and then even after I allowed you to return. Like, what was that like for you? How did that make you feel? Is there a way forward for us? Will you forgive me for the ways that I failed, for the ways that I have come up short? Imagine that David could have even mentored Absalom at this point. He could have shared with Absalom from his own life experiences, from his own lessons learned. If anybody knew how to put their life back together, it was David. He'd had to put his life back together. He could have coached Absalom in some of that. I think of the story that Jesus told about the prodigal son. Remember how the man in the story had 2 sons, and one went off and totally dishonored his dad and, brought shame to the family name and all of that. And then the story is told about how when he came home, hoping only that his dad would receive him like as a servant, not even as a son, that his dad ran to greet him, would have none of that talk. Instead, received him not as a servant, but right back as a son, and even threw a huge party to celebrate his return. What if David had been that father? In his book, Leap Over the Wall, Eugene Peterson throws that question out. Like, why didn't David share with Absalom what God had shared with David? The way that God had forgiven David and spared David's life. Why didn't David share that mercy and that grace with his son? Learning from our mistakes, we can learn from our cascading regret, we can learn from our avoidance regret, and finally we can learn from what they call irreparable regret. Look at chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. After this had happened, that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Now Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way of the gate, to the gate. So it was whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, "What city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your case is good and right, but there is no deputy of the king to hear you." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that I were made judge in the land, and everyone who has any suit or cause would come to me, then I would give him justice." And so it was, whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand and take him and kiss him. In this manner, Absalom acted toward all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. You see what Absalom's doing here. Absalom is turning against his dad, and he's winning over the hearts of the people to be a part of that. So to steal the hearts of the people, he's out there shaking hands, kissing babies, making campaign promises he can't keep, like a U.S. presidential election. But all of this is happening right under David's nose. And so in verse 7, now it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord. For your servant took a vow while I dwelt at Geshur in Syria, saying, if the Lord indeed brings me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord." And the king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. Now, I said earlier that some people think that Absalom was 40 years old. And this is the reason why. Because after 40 years, this really doesn't make sense. Some manuscripts read after 4 years, though even that, not entirely sure what to do with. So there's some question here about whether or not there's just this slight corruption in the text between 4 and 40. If so, what 4 means. If 40 is correct, then, could it refer to Absalom's age? We're just not really sure about that. Verse 10, then Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigns in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men invited from Jerusalem. And they went along innocently and did not know anything. They didn't know that Absalom was planning a coup. Then Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Boy, we'll get to talk more about Ahithophel in future messages. David's counselor from his city, from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy grew strong, for the people with Absalom continually increased in number. Now a messenger came to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. Let's read just a couple more verses. This is venturing in a little bit into territory we're going to cover next week, but just a couple verses. Verse 14. So David said to all his servants who are with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. Make haste to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster upon us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. So, wow. Notice verse 14, let us flee. Yeah. David's come full circle. Remember all those years he spent on the run from Saul? And now he's on the run from his own son, Absalom. Before David was king, he spent those years in the wilderness. And now, with his son pulling off this coup, back to the wilderness he goes. And this is where we could talk about what they call irreparable regret. This is, for example, neglecting a relationship until it's permanently broken. That spectrum of regret we talked about. I mean, on the mild end, you can think about missed social opportunities, or maybe in the moderate category, those faded friendships. But then in the major category, we think of those strained family ties, long-term estrangement, unresolved conflicts. Are there any of those in your family like there are in mine? Yeah, it's painful, isn't it? Well, as it relates to parenthood in particular, in Colossians 3, verse 21, it says fathers, a Greek word that can refer to mothers or fathers, just parents. Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. That word provoke there in the Greek text means to excite, to anger, to provoke, to irritate, and it can include the idea of neglect. One of the ways that we can provoke our children is by neglecting them, and the result is that they might become discouraged. That word means to lose heart. We want our kids to take heart. We want our grandkids to take heart. But if we're not careful, if we neglect them, they may lose heart. But David is just so disengaged. I mean, when it came to Amnon and Tamar, David knew nothing. When it came to Absalom and Amnon, David knew nothing. And now when it comes to Absalom and David himself, David knew nothing. There's so much happening under his nose that he is completely unaware of. It's that disengagement. It's that neglect. I wonder how people watching David raise these kids would have described him. I mean, I can imagine some people saying, man, this is amazing. David grew up in the pasture and he's raising his kids in the palace. Think of all the treasure. But I wonder how how Absalom would have described his dad and his parenting. I think Absalom would have said, treasure? Man, I just wanted time. I just wanted my dad to be involved in my life. Just wanted him to pay attention to me. And even as the parents of adult children, this is an important thing, that our kids as adults know that we think about them, that we pray for them, that we have a great interest in where they live and where they work and who their friends are and what they do for fun, what their hobbies are, what brings them joy, like that we know about and care about that stuff. David had neglected Absalom for so long that eventually the relationship was broken beyond repair. Yeah, learning from our mistakes, man. Cascading regret, avoidance regret, irreparable regret. David sure had his hands full at this point in time, didn't he? We're going to pick the story up next week, but I heard one time about a mother of 3 unruly preschoolers who was asked whether she would have children if she had it to do over again. And sure, she said, just not the same 3. I wonder if David would have been like, yeah, just not Amnon or Absalom or maybe some others in the brood. Oh, goodness. Well, gosh, what a story. I mean, you know, as Peterson points out, Amnon sinned. And Absalom responded by sinning. And David responded to that by sinning. I mean, you could say that David lost Amnon because of Absalom's sin, but he lost Absalom because of his own sin. Was he learning from his mistakes? Was he becoming a better man? Will we learn from our mistakes? What will we learn from our mistakes? I mean, when it comes to cascading regret, can we learn that when we set a bad example, others may follow it? And can we think about that before we set the bad example rather than after? And maybe more importantly, can we remember that a good example is just as powerful? That when we set a good example, when we do the right thing for the right reasons, the right way, at the right time, people may follow that example to great ends. And what about avoidance regret? I mean, can we learn that avoidance isn't a strategy? It's never served us before, and it isn't going to serve us now or going forward. But when we choose engagement, the things can and do improve. Like, this is the time. If there's something in your life or in mine that we've just been avoiding, this is the time to deal with it. And then irreparable regret. Can we learn that neglect may cause irreparable harm to the most important relationships in our life? But conversely, that given attention and care, those relationships can flourish. Oh man, learning from our mistakes. Yeah, we don't just have to, be stuck with all of the regrets that accompany our mistakes, but we can actually learn from our mistakes, and we can do better, and we can be better. Like, we can allow God to use these life lessons to change everything for us and the people around us.
And now it's time to fill out a Connect card.
Yeah, just go to the website, solachurch.live, scroll to the bottom of the homepage. That's where the Connect card lives. Let us know that you attended online today, especially if it's your first time. And also, that's where you can request information about our virtual small groups.
And don't forget, go and follow Sola Church on social media.
Yeah, at Sola Church LA, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X if you prefer.
TikTok, all of them.
Yeah, that's right.
And we hope that everyone has a great week. And we will see you next time at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody.